Tucked away in the mountains of Northern California lies the former resort town of Keddie. It isn't the kind of place you pass through on your way somewhere else. You have to go there on purpose. Surrounded by forest, cut through by winding roads and a stretch of railroad, Keddie was once a small but active vacation destination. Quiet in the off-season, still in the air, the sound of wind and trees carrying more than the voices of people. By the early 1980s, it had lost much of its appeal as a resort. The cabins that once hosted visitors were being rented out year-round, mostly to families looking for affordable housing in the rural hills of Plumas County. One of those families was the Sharps. They arrived in Keddie in late 1980, just a few months before everything changed. Glenna Susan Sharp, who went by Sue, had moved to California with her 5 children after leaving her husband. She was looking for a fresh start, somewhere quieter, somewhere cheaper. Keddie offered that. It wasn't ideal, but it was stable. The family settled into Cabin 28, a plain, weathered wooden structure with a small front porch and a view of the trees across the narrow road. The kind of place that didn't ask much of its residents, just that they kept the lights on, paid the rent, and made do with what was there. Sue Sharp was 36 years old. She was doing her best with limited means. Raising 5 children alone was never going to be easy, but she kept them together. She was not well known in the community, quiet by nature, a little reserved, but her children made connections. They were active in school, social with neighbors, present in the small world that existed inside the valley of Keddie. Sue didn't seek out attention. She worked small jobs, sometimes relied on assistance, and focused her energy on stability. The oldest of her children, John, was 15. His younger sister, Sheila, was 14. Tina, 12. Rick, 10. And Greg, just 5 years old. They lived together in the 2-bedroom cabin, stretched a little thin but managing. The older siblings helped with the younger ones. There was routine, even if it wasn't always easy. The family dynamic was shaped by necessity more than comfort, but there was warmth, too, according to those who knew them. Cabin 28 was close to others, Cabin 27 next door, and several more scattered nearby. The small cluster of homes created a kind of loose-knit neighborhood, where people might not have been close, but they saw each other often. Kids played outside. Adults smoked on porches. There was movement, but not much noise. The silence of the forest around them made every small sound feel louder. A screen door closing, footsteps in the gravel, the low hum of conversation through open windows. Sue did what she could to keep her children grounded. She let them have friends over. They spent time at the neighbors. Sheila was especially close with a girl living just next door. Tina, the quieter of the girls, often followed along but didn't say much. John, at 15, had started to drift a bit. He was experimenting with boundaries, hanging out with older teens. It wasn't unusual for kids that age. He wasn't known to be in trouble, but like many teenagers in small, rural towns, he was looking for something more than what Keddie seemed to offer. The cabin itself was modest. 2 bedrooms, one at either end of the structure, with a central living room in between. There was a small kitchen off to the side. Thin walls, dim lighting. At night, the whole place could be crossed in a matter of seconds. It wasn't isolated, but it felt that way sometimes, especially when the wind moved through the trees and the sky darkened early, and the only lights came from windows lit by bare bulbs or small TVs. By April 1981, the Sharps had been in Cabin 28 for just under half a year. They were still new to town, but not strangers anymore. The children were in school. Sue was still adjusting. They had built something steady, if not comfortable. They were doing what so many families in places like Keddie did, holding together, quietly, without much fanfare. Nothing about them seemed to suggest that danger would come. But on the night of April 11, 1981, it did. The rhythm of life inside Cabin 28 was simple, quiet, structured by necessity. With so many people under one roof and space at a premium, everyone had their own way of moving through the house. The children had their own responsibilities, small routines that helped keep things steady. Mornings were often hurried. Breakfasts were basic. School days meant early starts, quick goodbyes, and long bus rides into town. Sue kept the household together as best she could. Money was tight, and jobs were inconsistent, but she made it work. There was food on the table, even if meals were modest. The children had clothes and shoes, even if they were worn. She didn't ask for help often, and when she did, it was with restraint. She had lived through hardship before. Keddie, for all its remoteness, had felt like a chance to regroup. It wasn't perfect, but it was affordable, and it was away from the life she'd left behind. Cabin 28 had 2 bedrooms. Sue shared one with her 2 youngest boys, Rick and Greg. The other room belonged to the older children, John and his sisters Tina and Sheila. It was a tight arrangement. Tina sometimes slept on the living room floor. Sheila spent nights next door with a close friend. But somehow it all worked. There was a routine, if not much privacy. During the day, the children attended school in nearby Quincy. It wasn't a long drive, but it took time by bus, and most of the kids from Keddie traveled together. They knew each other from school hallways, shared homework, and played together after classes. Keddie was small, and Cabin 28 was at the center of that smallness. There were children in nearby cabins, teenagers who hung around the general store, and adults who kept mostly to themselves. John, the eldest, was beginning to assert his independence. He had a group of friends who came around often, older boys mostly, some with reputations, others just passing time like teenage boys do. They gathered in the evenings, sometimes inside the cabin, sometimes out front, leaning on railings or sitting on the steps. They played music, smoked cigarettes, talked about what little there was to do in Plumas County. Some of them had records with law enforcement, petty theft, breaking into sheds. Nothing violent, at least not that people talked about, but enough to make Sue uneasy. Still, she didn't push them away. She knew teenagers needed connection, and John didn't like being treated like a child. So she let them visit but kept watch, kept boundaries, even if she didn't always enforce them. Tina, younger than the others, kept more to herself. She was often described as shy, quiet, and thoughtful. She followed her sister Sheila around, but rarely led conversations. She was at that in-between age, not quite a teenager, not quite a child. She tried to stay close to her mother, helped when asked, and kept her head down when the house was busy. Sheila, on the other hand, was more social. She had formed a close friendship with a girl named Alyssa who lived in Cabin 27, right next door. The two spent much of their free time together, doing homework, talking about school, planning small things. On many nights, Sheila slept over at the neighbor's place rather than at home. It had become routine. The Sharp children were not isolated. They weren't kept from the outside world. They walked through town, attended school dances, made weekend plans. But they also lived with the weight of growing up in a house where the balance was fragile. There was love, but there was also stress. Sue tried to protect them from that, but it was always just under the surface. She had a few friends of her own in Keddie, though she was known to be private. She wasn't the kind of woman who shared much about her personal life unless she trusted someone. She rarely spoke about her ex-husband. She didn't socialize often beyond her immediate circle. She had been through a great deal before moving to Keddie, and that shaped the way she kept her guard up. Those who knew her described her as strong. Not loud, not confrontational, just steady. The family had plans for Easter that year. It was approaching soon. April 12th would be a Sunday, and the children were looking forward to a simple day together. Nothing elaborate, just something to mark the holiday. That Saturday, April 11th, was meant to be uneventful. A day like any other. It began quietly. It ended in a way no one could have imagined. But in the hours before nightfall, Cabin 28 was still just a home. A place full of life, full of voices, full of the ordinary sounds that families make. Nothing out of place. Not yet. Saturday, April 11th, 1981, unfolded slowly in Keddie, California. The air was cool, the kind of early spring day where clouds drifted low across the mountaintops and the trees stayed still in the wind. The cabins, scattered throughout the quiet hillside, held their usual hush. People moved in and out of doorways, children played nearby, but nothing stood out. Inside Cabin 28, the Sharp family had a mostly normal day. It was the kind of weekend where small errands get done, laundry is folded, and plans are made without much urgency. Sue stayed close to home. The kids moved in and out, some on bikes, others walking to and from the neighboring cabins. There was no school, no immediate obligations, just space to breathe. John, Sue's oldest, had plans for the evening. He'd arranged to spend time with his friend Dana Wingate, a 17-year-old boy from Quincy. Dana had his own complicated past, having spent time in a foster program for a period, and he'd been in and out of trouble. Still, he and John were close. That afternoon, they met up and eventually made their way into Quincy, where they were seen by several people. They reportedly visited a few friends, and some accounts say they may have attended a party briefly. But the details of their evening were never firmly confirmed. Nothing unusual was reported. They were just two teenagers out for a Saturday night. Back at the cabin, the younger children, Rick, Greg, and their friend Justin Smart, were passing the time in the living room. Justin had been invited to sleep over. His family lived just a few cabins away, and he was a regular presence in the Sharp home. He was around the same age as Rick and Greg. The boys were close, spending afternoons watching TV, talking about music, or playing outside. That night, they planned to watch some cartoons before bed. Sue and Tina were also at home. Tina had been at a friend's house earlier in the day, but had returned to cabin 28 by the evening. It wasn't clear exactly what time she came home, but she was there that night. Tina, 12 years old, often floated between spaces. Too old to be grouped with the youngest kids. Too young to stay out late like her older siblings. That evening, she stayed in. Quiet, reserved, and mostly unseen. Sheila, the second oldest, had made plans to spend the night next door with her best friend Alyssa in cabin 27. It wasn't unusual. She had slept there many times before. Sue was fine with it. Sheila packed a few things and left sometime before it got dark. It was a short walk across a gravel patch, past a few trees, and into the neighboring doorway. She could still see her home from there. As night fell, cabin 28 closed in on itself. No one knew it would be the last evening the family would ever spend together. In town, John and Dana prepared to return home. Sometime that evening, likely around 9:30 or 10 p.m., they began their trip back to Keddie. The walk from Quincy to the cabin was nearly 6 miles, mostly along rural backroads. They had no car, and there are no known reports of how they traveled. Some believe they hitched a ride, others that they walked. The sheriff's department never confirmed the exact path. What is known is that by the time the boys returned to the cabin, it was late. The house was dim. The front porch light may have been on. Inside, the younger boys were likely asleep, or close to it. Justin was still staying the night. Tina and Sue were both home. And somewhere between the moment John and Dana arrived and the early hours of the next morning, everything changed. No one outside the cabin would hear a thing. No screams. No noise. No one would report seeing anything suspicious. Keddie, as always, remained quiet through the night. It wasn't until the next morning that the silence broke. The morning of Sunday, April 12, 1981, Easter Sunday, began like most mornings in Keddie, still, overcast, and quiet. The birds moved through the trees without hurry. Doors remained closed. In the distance, the hum of the railroad could sometimes be heard, though even that was softened by the early hour. In cabin 27, just next door, Sheila Sharp woke early. She had spent the night with her best friend, Alyssa, something she did often and without concern. The two girls had gone to bed late, and the house remained quiet as they stirred that morning. At some point, Sheila gathered her things and stepped outside to return home. It was just a few yards to her front door. Gravel underfoot, the sharp edge of cool air. Nothing felt out of place. But when she opened the door to cabin 28, she stopped. The scene that greeted her was unlike anything she had ever known. Inside the living room, 3 people lay still: her mother, Sue, her brother John, and his friend Dana. The room was quiet, but something was deeply, immediately wrong. Sheila turned and ran. She returned to the neighbor's cabin, told them something had happened. Within minutes, an adult from cabin 27 crossed the lawn and entered cabin 28. They saw what Sheila had seen. This time, someone called the sheriff. The report was made just after 8 a.m. Deputies arrived within minutes. The responding officer stepped into the cabin and saw what had already been described. The living room bore the signs of intense violence. The bodies of Sue, John, and Dana were positioned near one another, though none showed signs of having died quickly. There were visible injuries. There were signs of struggle. What stood out most was the silence, the quiet that surrounded such a brutal scene. Inside the bedroom where Sue usually slept, they found something else: 3 children alive. Rick, Greg, and their friend Justin were in the room, untouched, physically unharmed. The boys had slept through the night and remained there until the sheriff arrived. Whether they had heard anything was not clear at first. The investigators didn't press them that day, but they were removed from the cabin and taken to a nearby home for care. Tina, however, was missing. At first, there was confusion. Had she been out with friends? Had she left earlier that morning? Sheila insisted she had returned the night before. Sue would never have allowed her to leave again. Tina should have been there, but she wasn't. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that a window had been broken. The cabin's front door was unlocked. The back door was left slightly open. On the kitchen table, a phone had been taken off the hook. The lines tangled, the cord stretched. A window curtain was partly torn. One small lamp was tipped. Nothing had been stolen. The details added up to something, but not something that made immediate sense. 3 people were dead, 1 child was missing, and 3 younger boys had remained asleep through it all, or so it seemed. The crime scene should have been secured immediately, but it wasn't. Multiple people walked through the cabin that morning. Neighbors, first responders, even curious residents. Some were trying to help. Some were simply too close to stay away. But the result was contamination, footprints, fingerprints, moved objects. Key details were disturbed in those first few hours, and whatever evidence may have existed in clean form was quickly compromised. The sheriff's department began to ask questions. Family members were interviewed. Neighbors, too. The children were taken in for care and slowly separated so they could speak without influence. Sheila, still in shock, gave her account of when she last saw her family. No one had heard anything loud that night. No screams, no shouts, no sounds of a struggle. But the level of violence inside cabin 28 suggested something prolonged had taken place. This had not been a quick attack. Whoever had done it had spent time inside the cabin. They hadn't rushed. They had used objects from inside the house. And yet, somehow, no one nearby had been woken by the sound. As deputies tried to form a timeline, one question kept surfacing. Where was Tina? The first hours of the investigation into what happened inside cabin 28 were filled with more confusion than clarity. Sheriff's deputies cordoned off the property, but not before a number of people had already walked through the cabin. Some had tried to help. Others had entered simply because the door had been left open. Each step, each hand that touched a surface, made the task of collecting clean evidence harder. But even as the crime scene remained active, attention turned quickly to what wasn't there. Tina Sharp, 12 years old, quiet, slightly built. She had been in the house the night before. Her sister, Sheila, remembered seeing her there before going next door to spend the night. And now she was gone. There was no sign of forced removal. No blood trail leading outside. No broken window, no scream heard by neighbors. She had vanished from the same space where 3 others had been killed, and no one saw it happen. The idea that she might have been abducted, rather than killed in the same attack, was terrifying and difficult to process. Deputies expanded the perimeter. They walked the surrounding woods, called in tracking dogs. The hope was that Tina had fled the cabin in fear, that she had hidden somewhere and was waiting to feel safe, that she might come back on her own. But as the hours passed, that hope diminished. She wasn't in the tree line. She wasn't along the tracks. Her name was added to a growing list of questions. Where had she gone? Why was she taken? And who had the time or the reason to take her from that room? The surviving boys, Rick, Greg, and Justin, were interviewed gently. They had spent the night just feet from where the attack occurred. At first, they said they hadn't heard anything. They had slept through the night. But over time, things became less certain. Justin, in particular, began to shift his statements. He offered, in later interviews, fragments of memory, vague images. He spoke of hearing voices, or possibly waking during the night and seeing parts of the attack. These accounts were inconsistent, and investigators at the time weren't sure how much weight to give them. Whether he had seen something real or imagined what he feared might have happened was never clarified. But still, his name appeared in report after report as someone who might know more than he could articulate. He was 8 years old, and in a case already drifting into confusion, his memories became a thread investigators would return to again and again, sometimes pressing harder than they should have. Meanwhile, the investigation into the 3 killings began in earnest. Autopsies confirmed that the victims had been killed violently, with more than one weapon. Blunt objects, knives, items from inside the cabin, used and discarded. The crime had been personal, messy, and it seemed deliberate. Whoever had entered Cabin 28 had done so with some knowledge of the home and of the family. There was no sign that the killings had been random. Nothing had been stolen. There was no graffiti, no threat left behind. The attack had been methodical, not rushed. And perhaps most unsettling of all, there were signs that the killers had stayed in the cabin for some time after the murders. Some details were never shared with the public, but investigators would later confirm that the phone lines had been disconnected and that a window curtain had been used to cover part of the scene, actions that suggested time and intent, not panic. Still, there was no sign of forced entry, and that meant it was possible Sue or one of the children had let someone in. If so, that meant the family might have known their killers. As the hours turned to days, the investigation continued, but quietly. There were no public appeals, no press conferences, no sketches released. Keddie, already a quiet place, grew more still. Children were kept indoors. Families kept their lights on at night. The cabins that once felt peaceful now felt isolated. People locked their doors, looked through their windows more than they had before. The murders changed the rhythm of the town almost overnight. Theories began to circulate. Some neighbors whispered about John Sharp's older friends, teenagers and young adults who had a reputation for drugs or theft. Others believed it had to be someone from outside town, someone passing through. But no one knew for sure. And the longer the investigation dragged on without a clear direction, the more doubt grew. The sheriff's office promised it was doing everything it could, but behind the scenes, some choices were already narrowing the scope of the case. In the weeks and months following the killings inside Cabin 28, investigators began to settle into a familiar pattern. One built on interviews, background checks, and the slow, sometimes imprecise process of narrowing down a list of people who might have had motive or opportunity. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office assigned multiple deputies to the case, and while they maintained outward professionalism, behind the scenes the investigation was already losing structure. The first problem was the crime scene itself. From the beginning, it had been compromised. In the hours after the bodies were found, multiple people, including neighbors, friends, and even a clergy member, had entered the cabin before the area had been formally secured. That movement disrupted key evidence. It made the tracking of footprints and fingerprints more difficult. Items had been touched. Some had even been moved. And with each passing hour, the cabin became less of a scene and more of a question mark. But the greater problem, perhaps, was that the investigation lacked focus. The scope was too wide at first, then too narrow, and then ultimately scattered. Still, names began to surface. One of the first was Martin Smart. Martin lived just a few cabins down from the Sharps. He was the stepfather of Justin, the boy who had stayed the night and survived. Martin was known in the small Keddie community. He was a former cook at the Keddie Lodge, often described as erratic and moody. His relationship with his wife, Marilyn, was unstable, marked by frequent arguments. There were reports of controlling behavior and emotional volatility. By the time of the murders, that instability had become visible to others in the area. Martin had reportedly been at home the night of the killings. He later told investigators that he and a friend Bo Babade, had been out that evening and then returned to the cabin to watch television. Bo, whose full name was John Babade, was a man in his 50s who had recently arrived in Keddie. He had a criminal background, though the extent of it was unclear at the time. He and Martin had become close in a short period, and both had been seen around the area in the days before the murders. According to Martin, the two of them had gone to bed at a reasonable hour and hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. That was their story, but inconsistencies began to appear quickly. Investigators questioned Martin and Bo in the days following the crime. There are few public records of what was said in those early interviews, but it is known that Martin's wife, Marilyn, moved out shortly after the killings. She took Justin and left the area. Later, she would tell authorities and others that she had long suspected her husband had been involved, that he had made strange, unsettling comments in the days after the murders, that she had overheard conversations between him and Bo that felt rehearsed, and that Martin had suddenly burned a pair of shoes in the fireplace. Shoes he said he no longer needed. Despite this, no arrest was made. Martin and Bo were not charged. They were not publicly named as suspects. And within weeks, Bo left town altogether. Martin would eventually move as well. For those paying attention, the silence around them was difficult to understand. There were clear red flags, statements from family members, strange behavior, and a proximity to the crime scene that couldn't be ignored. Yet law enforcement remained hesitant. Some would later suggest that connections between Martin and local authorities may have influenced the investigation. Others believed it was simply a case of inexperience, a small department overwhelmed by a large, complicated crime. What is known is that the case began to stall. The initial urgency faded. Leads were followed loosely, then dropped. Suspects were not pressed. Evidence sat unprocessed. The scene in Cabin 28 remained haunting, but now it was also quiet. With no official updates, the town returned to its daily rhythm, though nothing felt the same. Tina Sharp was still missing. No traces had been found. No credible sightings had been reported. Her name faded from headlines, but never from her family's thoughts. For Sue's surviving children, Sheila, Rick, and Greg, the absence remained sharp. They were placed with relatives, their lives uprooted. Nothing had prepared them for what they'd seen, what they'd lost, and no one had yet told them why it had happened. A full year had passed since the morning Sheila Sharp opened the door to Cabin 28 and stepped into something no child should ever see. In that time, the investigation had moved slowly. Theories were raised, then dropped. Suspects were spoken to, then allowed to leave town. Files sat unfinished. Evidence sat untested. And through it all, one name remained painfully absent from every update: Tina Sharp. For over a year, she had been missing. No signs of her had been found. No articles of clothing, no trace of movement, no confirmed sightings. Her photo had been circulated throughout California and surrounding states. Her description had been broadcast by local news and mailed to other jurisdictions. But she had not returned. No one had come forward to say they'd seen her. And quietly, Tina's case shifted from a missing child to something colder, something more final. Her name was added to national registries. Her file, though open, was growing dusty. The Sharp family, what was left of it, had been pulled apart and scattered. Sheila, Rick, and Greg had moved in with relatives. They were teenagers now, or close to it, but the memories of that night remained as vivid as ever. The silence that followed had not dulled the pain. They had been promised justice. Instead, they were left with paperwork and pauses. It was not closure. It was absence. And then, in the spring of 1984, something surfaced. April 11th, exactly 3 years to the day after the murders. A man scavenging for bottles in the woods, over 100 miles away from Keddie, came across a fragment of a human skull. He had been near Camp 18 in Butte County, not far from Feather Falls. It was rural country, deep forest, out of the way. At first, he wasn't sure what he had found. The bone fragment was small, but nearby he discovered other remains. Bits of clothing, a child's jacket, a few pieces of what had once been a shoe. It didn't look recent. Law enforcement was called to the scene. The area was cordoned off, and the remains were collected carefully. The bones were sent for analysis. And not long after, the results came back. They belonged to Tina Sharp, 3 years missing, found by accident, discarded in the woods hours from her home. The news hit hard, even after so much time. Her family had been holding on to the smallest thread of hope, that somehow Tina had escaped, had been taken but kept alive, that she might find her way home someday. Now that thread was gone. The recovery of her remains opened new questions. How had she gotten there? Had she been killed the same night as the others and moved later? Or had she been alive for a time, days, weeks longer? Had someone kept her? And more pressingly, why had the investigation failed to find her? The area where she was discovered wasn't especially well traveled, but it was known to law enforcement. If her remains had been placed there shortly after the murders, why had no search effort included it? Why had there been no aerial surveys? No grid walks? The discovery led to renewed interest in the case. Briefly, the sheriff's office gave a short statement. They confirmed the identity of the remains and said the investigation was once again active. But no arrests followed. No charges were filed. And within weeks, the silence returned. Even with Tina's body recovered, the trail remained cold. Years passed. Rumors grew. In Keddie and Quincy, people still talked, though less than before. Some had moved away. Others stayed quiet. Martin Smart, still considered by many to be a suspect, was living in Nevada by then. His former wife, Marilyn, had never changed her statement. She believed her ex-husband had been involved. She had told law enforcement about strange comments, missing items, even shoes burned in the days after the murders. But Martin had never been arrested. Neither had his friend, Beau Babade, who had died in 1988. Files on both men sat in evidence rooms, pages of typed interviews, timelines, and notes with questions written in the margins. But little was done with them. For Tina's siblings, the recovery of her remains did not bring peace. Her funeral was small, quiet, the kind that doesn't offer closure, only a pause. They buried her with care. But the questions were still there. What had happened to her? Who had taken her? And why had no one been held responsible? As the 1990s came and went, the case of the murders in Cabin 28 drifted into a quieter place. Not solved, not closed, but left to sit behind the closed doors of an evidence room. Occasionally, someone would mention it. A name might surface in a local paper. A neighbor might recall that terrible morning. But in any official capacity, the investigation had become still. Files were stored. Photos were boxed. The tape recordings, reports, interviews, they were no longer part of a daily effort. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office, small to begin with, had limited resources. Other crimes came, other cases moved to the front. The few deputies who had worked the scene in 1981 retired or transferred. New officers came in. The story of Cabin 28 became something new recruits heard about, not something they worked. There was never an announcement that the case was cold. There didn't need to be. It was obvious. No arrests. No charges. No one held accountable. Only questions. Only silence. Tina's remains, found in 1984, had briefly brought attention back to the case. But when that attention passed, it never truly returned. A child missing for years, found in the woods with no answers, yet no push to re-interview suspects. No re-examination of forensic evidence. No media push. Her discovery, for all its emotional weight, became another unresolved detail in a case already full of them. Her siblings tried to move forward. Sheila, Rick, and Greg all grew up carrying a story that never left them. It shaped how they entered adulthood. It stayed present, even in the background. There was grief, but there was also a sense of betrayal, not only by whoever had taken their family from them, but by the way the case had been allowed to slip from view. They had spoken to detectives. They had answered questions. They had waited, but the waiting was not met with action. The years made it clear that the weight of this crime would be theirs to carry, not the department's. And yet, the story of the Keddie Cabin Murders never fully disappeared. It remained in the margins, passed from person to person, whispered in forums, retold in fragments. Not because it was sensationalized, but because it remained unresolved. There was something in the nature of the case, its setting, its violence, its silence, that lingered. The cabin itself, over time, fell into disrepair. Still located in the now sparsely populated Keddie Resort area, Cabin 28 sat vacant for years. Some people came to take pictures. Others avoided it altogether. It had become more than a structure. It was a space that held something heavy. And for the families involved, it was more than that. It was a grave. Eventually, the cabin was demolished. Not ceremoniously, not publicly, just quietly taken down. There was no marker left in its place. No memorial, just empty space. And in some ways, that mirrored the case itself. It had once held everything. Now it held nothing. It wasn't the passage of time alone that kept the case quiet. It was the absence of movement within the systems meant to pursue answers. In the decades following the murders in Cabin 28, law enforcement in Plumas County changed hands more than once. Officers came and went, and with each shift in leadership, the case seemed to settle further into the background. For a long time, no one reopened the boxes. No one pushed the old tapes into a recorder. The notes taken in hurried handwriting the morning of April 12, 1981, remained stored on paper that had begun to yellow at the edges. Statements were filed but not revisited. Leads were noted, then never followed. The men most often whispered about, Martin Smart and John Beau Babade, had left town long ago. One had died. The other lived out his life away from the crime scene. With no charges filed, no new forensic technology applied, and little public pressure, the case remained where it had been left, unfinished. But time has a way of shifting perspectives. In the 2000s, when a new wave of public interest in cold cases began to rise, fueled by the growth of digital archives and amateur sleuthing, attention began to turn, slowly, back toward Keddie. What had once been a local tragedy, spoken of only in small-town circles, began to surface in broader conversations. People wanted to know why. Why 3 people were brutally killed and a child taken, and no one had been held responsible. Why, with modern tools available, the case had never been re-examined in full. Why the files had sat still for so long. It wasn't media attention that finally moved things forward. It was a decision within the sheriff's office. By the early 2010s, a new investigator, Josh Hancock, began to look at the case with fresh eyes. Alongside him, Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood, who had lived in the area back in 1981, gave his support to a deeper, more serious reinvestigation. They started where the original team had left off. They pulled files from storage, reviewed photographs, replayed interviews. What they found was both overwhelming and disappointing. The original investigation had documented much, but followed little. Some suspects had never been fully questioned. Evidence had been collected but never tested. Reports contradicted each other. Details had been misfiled, others overlooked entirely. What they saw more than anything was a case that had been paused, not closed, not even truly cold, just paused and left waiting. They began with the basics. Timelines confirmed sightings, known movements. They re-interviewed surviving family members and those who had once lived in Keddie. They listened to the surviving children with care. They revisited the claims Marilyn Smart had made years earlier about the suspicious behavior of her ex-husband, the pair of shoes he burned, the uneasy conversations he had with Beau in the days after the murders. New forensic tests were ordered. Technology that didn't exist in 1981 was now available. DNA analysis was applied to evidence that had sat dormant in sealed containers. Partial prints were re-examined. Items found in the cabin were retested. One of the most chilling discoveries came not from new evidence, but from the files themselves. A handwritten note had been overlooked or buried in the years prior. In that note, Martin Smart reportedly confessed to elements of the crime, writing about how he had paid the price for something that had happened to Sue Sharp and her family. The language was ambiguous, but the implication was undeniable. And yet he had never been arrested, never charged, and now he was gone. That note, combined with other inconsistencies in early statements and Marilyn's long-standing suspicions, shifted the investigation's tone from uncertainty to quiet frustration. There had been enough. There had been more than enough to justify pressure. A warrant, a formal interrogation, but none of that had happened. And now, the two men believed to have been responsible were no longer alive to answer. What remained were files, memories, and the irreversible consequences of delay. The findings uncovered during the reinvestigation weren't just painful because of what they revealed. They were painful because of how long they had sat ignored. For the Sharp family, and for those still living who remembered the days after April 11th, 1981, it wasn't just the murders that stayed with them. It was the knowledge that something could have been done sooner. That information had existed. That statements had been made. That evidence had been collected. And that none of it had been pursued when it mattered most. By the time law enforcement publicly acknowledged the renewed focus on the case in the early 2010s, decades had passed since Tina's remains were found. Her siblings were adults. The town of Keddie had grown even quieter, and many of the original residents had long since moved on or passed away. But the violence had never truly left. In communities like Keddie, events like the one that took place inside Cabin 28 don't fade with time. They root themselves in the foundation of local memory. They show up in conversation at dinner tables, in half-spoken references, in the unlit cabins at the edge of town that no one visits anymore. And when investigators like Josh Hancock and Sheriff Greg Hagwood began pulling those threads back into daylight, what they uncovered was not only evidence, but omission. There had been names. There had been statements. There had even been confession-like admissions. In 2016, a discovery behind the sheriff's department building changed everything yet again. A hammer, believed to match the description of a weapon Martin Smart had once owned, was found buried near the location. It had been tossed away, left to rust. The original hammer had never been found after the murders. And now, more than 30 years later, it surfaced just yards from where evidence had once been held. It was not enough for a conviction, but it was enough to reframe the story. The idea that two men, both known to the victims, both seen near the cabin, both tied to disturbing behavior, had committed the murders and walked away from the scene without consequence was no longer a rumor. It was a working theory, supported by documentation, timelines, and surviving testimony. And it had been there for decades. The hammer was sent for testing. The results were never publicly disclosed, but investigators confirmed it was consistent with the missing weapon. The weight, the size, the shape, it matched what was described in reports written in 1981. But again, the trail led nowhere new. Martin Smart had passed away in 2000. Bo Babade died in 1988. Both had left behind records. Both had left behind suspicion. But they had also taken whatever they knew with them. That left law enforcement in an impossible position, armed with more information than ever before, but with no living suspects to interrogate. No one to charge. No court to stand in. No trial to prepare for. For the Sharp family, the confirmation of long-held suspicions brought no real comfort. They had spent decades living in the shadow of what happened in Cabin 28. They had endured questions, assumptions, and silences. They had done their best to rebuild. But now they were being told what they already knew, that this wasn't a random act, that the killers were known, that the truth had been within reach all along. The reopening of the case brought media attention again briefly. Documentaries were made, podcasts recorded interviews, journalists reread files, and for a time, people outside of Keddie remembered what had happened. But then, like before, the world moved on. No official suspect was ever named in court. No final report was issued. The sheriff's department acknowledged the conclusions drawn by modern investigators, but they didn't frame it as resolution. Just acknowledgement, a confirmation of failure. That's what remained. Cabin 28 no longer exists. The building was demolished in the early 2000s. The foundation was cleared, and trees slowly grew back in its place. If you visit Keddie now, you won't find a memorial, a plaque, or even a marker where the house once stood. Just silence. And in that silence, the weight of what was lost. Not just a mother and her children, but the chance for justice. The chance to say with certainty who did this and why, and to say it while the people responsible were still alive to hear it. By the time the reinvestigation slowed and attention began to fade once again, there was no sense of relief for the people who had lived through it. No announcement ever came that the case had been closed, and yet there was nothing more left to wait for. Everyone involved knew it. The path to justice had narrowed so slowly over the years that by the time the right questions were asked, the answers were already buried. And what remained after all the noise, all the theories, all the movement and re-examinations, was something quiet and familiar. A family still grieving, a town still marked, and the understanding that justice is not always an outcome. Sometimes it's just the absence of forgetting. Sheila Sharp had lived with the memory of that morning for most of her life. She was 14 when she opened the door to her home and found her mother, her brother, and his friend lying still in the living room. Her sister was missing. Her voice, the first to call for help, the first to understand something was wrong. That moment never left her. Not through the funerals, not through high school, not through the years that followed. She had been polite in interviews, careful with what she said. Over the years, she'd spoken only when she felt it mattered. But behind each word, there was something heavier. She had waited through decades of silence while officials turned away from the facts. And when the truth came, it wasn't news to her. It was confirmation of what she'd lived with since she was a teenager. Her mother had been targeted, her family had been destroyed, and the men responsible had left Keddie untouched, watched quietly as years passed without consequence. Sheila did what survivors often do. She built a life. She worked. She raised children of her own. But nothing returned her to the person she'd been before that morning. Her voice never carried bitterness. Just wait, a steady kind of knowing. Rick and Greg, the two youngest brothers who had been sleeping just feet away from the violence that night, spoke even less. They were boys when it happened, too young to understand, but old enough to remember. They had grown up in the shadow of something that had no resolution. And as the years passed, they remained quiet. Publicly, they stayed removed. Their lives moved forward, but the loss moved with them. They had not been given answers. And in time, they stopped asking for them. In the broader story of Keddie, the cabin faded in its physical form, but not in memory. The foundation of Cabin 28 was cleared, the walls torn down, the land left blank. But to those who had lived there, and to those who still lived nearby, it remained one of the most painful places in the county. Not because of ghosts or rumors or strange energy, but because of what it represented: a failure to protect, a failure to pursue, a failure to acknowledge early and fully that something deeply wrong had happened, and that it mattered. Over time, the town changed. Fewer people remained. The Keddie Resort area, once built for vacationers, had become sparse. The tracks that ran through the trees still hummed with the occasional train. The roads, cracked and quiet, still curved along the forest edges. But most cabins were empty. Some were boarded up. Others collapsed into themselves with time. Keddie never recovered, and maybe it wasn't supposed to. What happened there didn't just take lives. It took trust. Trust in systems, in justice, in the belief that someone would answer for what had been done. When the reinvestigation surfaced in the 2010s and early 2020s, it brought one final shift. Not legal, not official, but personal. The story was told again, with care, with facts, with attention to what had gone wrong. Reporters, writers, and investigators began to share what had been found. The handwritten note, the recovered hammer, the timeline errors, the conflicting statements. And for the first time in decades, the full picture began to take shape. People started to understand not just what had happened, but how it had been allowed to remain unsolved for so long. The new investigators didn't solve the case in a court of law, but they did something else. They returned the truth to the family. They gave the survivors what the system had not. Acknowledgement. Not enough. Not nearly. But more than they'd had before. There was never a final report that said the case had been solved. There was no courtroom verdict, no official conviction, no headlines that read "Justice Served." For those who survived the events of April 11th, 1981, and the years that followed, what came instead was something harder to hold. A long, slow acceptance that the truth might always remain partial. That even when the lines of a story begin to make sense, they don't always lead to resolution. And yet, the story did not disappear. It continued in quiet ways, not in newspaper columns or television specials, but in the lives of those who had been closest to it, in the family that remained, in the officers who returned to the files with a steady hand, in the conversations that still take place on quiet porches and in small, dim rooms where someone finally feels ready to speak. For the Sharp family, life moved forward, not because the weight was lifted, but because it had to. The three children who survived that night, Sheila, Rick, and Greg, each carried something different with them. For Sheila, it was memory. She had seen the scene firsthand, had lived with the images, and for years felt alone in them. Later in life, when she chose to speak publicly, she did so without drama. Her words were slow, thoughtful, always grounded in the truth. She spoke not to reopen the wound, but to ensure it wasn't erased. Rick and Greg remained quiet. Their childhood had ended in a single night, and what came after was shaped by silence. They didn't appear often in interviews, but in every retelling of the story, their presence lingered. Two boys who had slept through a crime that would never leave them, their names always listed as survivors, even when they had no answers to offer. Tina's story was something else entirely. She had disappeared, leaving only questions behind. When her remains were found 3 years later, there was no message with them. No new lead, just bones in the woods, a jacket, a shoe. Enough to confirm what her family already feared. She had not escaped. She had not wandered. Someone had taken her, and then someone had left her behind. She was 12. There is a grave for her now, a place where her name is written, but it stands not as closure, only as proof that she was here. For the town of Keddie, the case remains a dividing line. There is life before Cabin 28, and life after. Though the town has changed, grown smaller, quieter, more fragmented, the memory of what happened hasn't faded. The cabin is gone. The crime scene no longer exists in physical form, but the shape of it remains in the people who still talk about that night, and in the ones who don't. Some neighbors have never spoken of it again. Others remember every detail, where the cars were parked, who they saw walking that evening, what the sheriff didn't do. There is no monument in Keddie, no formal memorial, just space and silence. And beyond Keddie, the story continues in the way it always has, passed slowly, retold with caution, studied by those who want to understand how something like this could go so long unresolved. New listeners arrive each year. They learn the names. They trace the timeline. They ask the same questions. Who did this? Why? And why didn't anyone stop them? And while the answers now seem clearer than they ever have been, they still come too late. Too late for Sue Sharp. Too late for John. Too late for Dana. Too late for Tina. And for the family left behind, those answers, partial, delayed, uncertain, do not rewrite the past. But they do settle it, if only slightly. They do offer something closer to truth. Even if truth comes without justice. Even if it comes in whispers. Even if it comes after the doors have already closed.